Hello everyone. Today we will be going over chapter 14 and talking about stress and health. And to begin with, we talk about the subfield of health psychology. And so again, this is a subfield of psychology concerned with the ways in which psychological factors influence the causes and treatment of physical illness and the maintenance of health. And so this whole chapter really drives home the message that our mind and our body is connected. And so our cognitions and our behaviors, whether that's health behaviors or how we perceive and how we feel that we can control our stress levels, all of these things are intertwined and they're mixed. And they all influence one another. And so one of the reasons we're actually quite certain that stress influences our health is because people tend to get sick when they're really stressed out. And so this is especially true after certain major life events, including finals week and even chronic stressors. So they've also found that people who report having lots of daily hassles, for example, a bad relationship plus long lines at the supermarket, plus a nagging relative, plus financial issues, tend to report more psychological and physical symptoms. Chronic stressors tend to be greater and longer lasting as opposed to major life events that happen one time and there's a period of time afterwards where you are adjusting, but then you move on. Chronic stressors, as the name suggests, are around for a longer time. So most chronic stressors are linked to particular environments, and so some examples of this would be features from city life like the noise, traffic, crowding, pollution, and threats of violence. These provide particularly consistent sources of chronic stress. So these are not only limited to the city, but also rural areas also have stressors as well. So they may feel more isolated and lack access to amenities such as quality health care. And so these findings are what led to the development of environmental psychology, or the scientific study of environmental effects on behavior and health. And so one study demonstrating the effect of the environment looked at the impact of attending schools under the flight path to LAX, where there are more than 300 jets per day in and out of the airport. So compared to children matched for race, economic background, and ethnicity who attended nearby schools away from the noise, children going to school in the flight path had higher blood pressure and gave up more easily when working on difficult problems. So we see again this relationship between the environment, our cognitions, our psychology, and the effects that it can have on our health. So most of our daily and even chronic stressors have one thing in common. We know what they are and we can do something about them. And it's not surprising then that the most stressful events are ones that we can't do anything about. And so, for example, sitting next to someone who smells terrible on an airplane with no empty seats, whereas in a gym you can hop over to the next machine, or in the car you could open a window. So there's just different environmental contexts that this may be present in. So the expectation that we know or that we have some kind of control over the situation or what happens to us is associated or correlated with effective coping. So if we know the source of the stress, we can attempt to decrease it through coping skills or doing some other type of behavior like getting up and moving. In one study, researchers found that participants who were asked to solve puzzles and proofread them in a loud room where they could push a button to stop the noise performed much better than those who were given no way of stopping the noise. Even when people never actually pushed the button, just knowing that they could push the button to stop the noise saved them from a high level of stress. So just knowing or having the thought or the cognition that you have control over that stressor led to better health outcomes. And so next we'll talk about stress reactions in our body. And so Walter Cannon was the first to coin the phrase fight or flight response, which he used to describe the body's response to any threatening stimulus like a rabid dog chasing you or giving a speech in front of 100 people. So our body during the flight or fight response is determining whether I should stay and fight or run like mad. And so this is where your hair stands on end, your heart beats faster, you turn pale or flushed, digestion slows down, pupils become dilated, and your hearing and your vision become more selective. So our brain activates in response to a threat, and this occurs along the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis. So as the figure demonstrates, the signal begins in the hypothalamus, and this stimulates the nearby pituitary gland, which in turn releases a hormone known as ACTH. So ACTH travels through the bloodstream and stimulates the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. The adrenal glands also release hormones, including these biochemicals that really just indicate that it's activating the emotional system. So this increase in activation in the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration rate. So the increased respiration and blood pressure make oxygen more available to our muscles so that we can attack or we can get up and escape. So the adrenal glands also release cortisol, and cortisol is a hormone that increases the concentration of glucose in the blood, which essentially acts as fuel for our muscles. Interestingly, the immune system is remarkably responsive to psychological influences. So stressors can cause hormones known as glucocorticoids to flood the brain, which wear down the immune system and make it less able to fight invaders like germs or viruses. So, for example, of this, in one study, medical student volunteers agreed to receive small wounds to the roof of their mouths. Researchers observed that these wounds healed more slowly during exam periods than during summer vacation because we see a difference in stress levels. In another study, a set of healthy volunteers allowed researchers to swab the common cold virus in their noses. Stressed participants, those who had lost a job or were having issues with family members or friends, were more susceptible to the virus than those who reported brief stressors or those lasting less than a month. So again, we see this connection between the immune system and it being remarkably responsive to psychological influences like stress. Psychological reactions to stress can also lead to stress disorders. One example of this is someone who lives through a terrifying and uncontrollable experience that may go on to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. PTSD is a disorder characterized by chronic physiological arousal, recurrent unwanted thoughts or images of that specific trauma or traumas, and avoidance of things that call the event to mind. So this is nowhere more apparent than in war, where these individuals may experience flashbacks of the battle, exaggerated anxiety and startle reactions like diving for the ground when fireworks go off or a car backfires. They may even experience medical conditions that do not arise from physical damage, such as paralysis or chronic fatigue. Often individuals experience an increased arousal and as a result have difficulty falling or staying asleep. They may be more irritable and experience difficulty with concentrating. Most of these symptoms are normal, appropriate responses to horrifying events. For most people, they subside with time, as is the case after you lose someone very close to you. We would expect that someone would go through a natural process of bereavement. With PTSD, the symptoms last much longer. So acute PTSD lasts less than 3 months. Chronic PTSD lasts longer than 6 months. And it's estimated that about 8% of Americans suffer from PTSD at some time in their lives. 15% of Vietnam veterans still had lingering symptoms of PTSD 20 years after combat. And so when we talk about these symptoms and the how long these individuals may experience these symptoms, this range may have changed because our diagnostic criteria has recently changed within the past year from DSM-4 text revision to DSM-5, our diagnostic manual. Also, when we talk about a large increase or a large proportion of Vietnam veterans that still had lingering symptoms, this may be because they, at that time, around the 70s, psychologists were still researching effective ways of treating PTSD, and in addition to creating a diagnostic criteria to diagnose these individuals with the right diagnosis. So we may see a larger proportion back then that are still fighting against these symptoms or experiencing them. So the major cause in these stress disorders is obviously stress. However, not everyone who is exposed to a traumatic event develops PTSD. This suggests that people differ in their degree of sensitivity to trauma and vulnerability to these symptoms, which may involve genetic vulnerability. So if your parents or grandparents were diagnosed with it, you may have this genetic predisposition to be vulnerable to this disorder, and or environmental stressors. MRI studies of brain structures of people diagnosed with PTSD have found differences in the size of their hippocampus. Researchers have found that the hippocampus was smaller in volume among individuals with PTSD. So we don't know if this was a pre-existing condition such that they were born with a smaller hippocampus that makes the brain more sensitive to stress, or if the traumatic stress itself somehow killed nerve cells. So twin studies have found that identical twins that were both exposed to war had similarly sized hippocampal volumes, suggesting that the smaller volume was not caused by combat. So thus, smaller hippocampal sizes may suggest a higher sensitivity to PTSD. And so that wraps up the first section of Chapter 14 on stress and health.